Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Blade Runner 3, Replicant Night, by K.W. Jeter. Chapter 5. At the landing field, in the bare red flats on the emigrant colony's edge, he got screwed. They wouldn't give Deckard his deposit back on the skiff. "What are you going to do?" said the man behind the desk, really just a buckling sheet of plywood supported by 2 empty fuel drums. The man took no pleasure in the burn, but just looked at Deckard with the flat, unblinking eyes of someone who knows he's being a bastard. "We're an illegal business already. You're going to report us or something? Get real." Deckard turned his own gaze away from the man's heavy, black, stubbled face and out toward the small interplanetary craft. Scattered over the rust-colored sands. From one hand dangled the briefcase with his initials on the tiny metal plate below his knuckles. "There's other ways," he said quietly, then looked back at the man, "of getting my money back." "Sure there is. You can beat the crap out of me for one." The man shrugged, crescents of sweat-darkened shirt riding up under his fleshy arms. "Whatever sings your song, buddy. I don't care." A slow, wobbling shake of the head. "But you're still not getting your money back. And don't ever bother bringing your business around here again. You ever want off planet, you'll have to flap your wings and jump." The briefcase whispered to Deckard. "Come on. Don't waste your time with this lowlife. We've got things to do." "You say something, pal?" "No." Deckard shook his head, just grumbling to myself. "Tell you what, I'll settle for half of what you owe me." He settled for nothing. He was too tired to argue any further. "Count your blessings," the skiff guy called after him from the doorway of the shack. "You got back here still breathing. Most of our customers don't. Our merchandise has got over a 50% failure rate." "Nice advertising pitch," Batty's voice spoke up, louder this time as Deckard totted the briefcase across the field. "Lot of possibilities. Rent from us and you'll never have to again." Deckard made no reply. If half of these things made it home, he thought gloomily, it'd be a miracle. With his free hand, he rubbed blood-tinged grit from his eyes. I must have been crazy. All around him, as he trudged in sinking footsteps, the skiffs dug lower in the sand, like the black eggs of some extinct, exhausted species. The vehicle's dented, corrosion-flecked carapaces transmitted a minimal wattage signal of neglect and abortive transport. Some of them, including the one he'd taken to the outer Hollywood station and back, looked as fragile as ancient Christmas decorations. Hand-blown glass that a sneeze could shatter. An indication of how desperate he must have been. And still am, thought Deckard. Even worse now. Getting stiffed on the deposit had chewed another major hole in his cash float. "Don't worry," the briefcase, Batty's voice inside, radiated a familiar confidence. I haven't even begun telling everything that's in store for you." "I can't wait." Deckard had to remind himself that Dave Holden had died in order to carry this thing out to him. He supposed he owed his dead ex-partner the posthumous courtesy of listening to it. Shading his eyes with one hand, he peered out of the limpy, fluttering, low-pressure bubble tunnel that extended from the rental yard shack. He was in luck, or as much of it as existed in his personal universe. Through the sand-scoured plastic, he spotted a worm-treaded shuttle working its way across the desert. The segmented ground transport was probably ferrying contract miners back from the jagged hills to the planet's east. He and the briefcase could hitch a ride all the way in to the immigrant colony's imploded center. "Now would be a good time to clam up again," he told the disembodied voice, sealing his mouth and nose off with the palm of his free hand. He unzipped the bubble's exit flap and shouldered out into the stinging wind to flag down the shuttle. "Hey, I'm discreet," the briefcase's voice slid through the crystals, stinging against the side of Deckard's face. "You're not the only person who can carry off a silent act." On the shuttle, he sat with the briefcase on his knees, sandwiched in between the mine workers on the scuffed steel benches, each breath taking in the mingled odors of their sweat. The jogging motion of the treads across the red dunes rocked the bodies from side to side, bumping hard into Deckard's shoulder. No conversations sounded in the shuttle's tight interior. The mine workers sat with their silted bandanas. The mine workers sat with their silted bandanas pulled down around their throats. Breath masks and rehydration tubes dangling disconnected like some amphibian species' vestigial organs. They all looked to Deckard like first-generation Mars natives. Some of the younger ones possibly second-gen, the children and grandchildren of the Earth-born immigrants who'd gotten this far and had then given up on getting all the way to the stars. Through eyelids drawn nearly as tight as the shuttle's slit windows, they gazed out on the landscape that they'd inherited, that they had evolved to possess. Deckard could sense the rewiring of the nervous systems sitting around and across from him, the shuffling of synaptic fibers and input receptors that had taken place in the womb, the human body's instinctive response to the foreign territory in which it had been exiled. The creatures around him that still wore the outward appearance of human beings were off the cable monopoly's feed. They didn't need the canned stimuli to survive. They could go out into the hills and dry ravines and suck up all the bandwidth this world had to offer. Deckard had wondered before what their strangers' eyes saw, what their spatulate, black-nailed fingertips read from the grains of red sand trickling through their touch. He'd given up wondering. He had enough trouble dealing with human things, and the things that were at least trying to be human. There was more in common between his blood and that of the replicants he'd killed before than there was between him and the sharp angled faces that stared past him as if he no longer existed. The fatigue seeping from Deckard's bones, forearms lying like dead weights across the briefcase in his lap, drew his eyelids shut. With the scent of alien sweat in his nostrils, the press of blood-warm flesh near his own, he almost believed himself to be back on Earth, in L.A., the dark, neon-veined city extending on all sides around one of the cramped public buses, shoving its way through the traffic stalled with retrofitted Detroit relics. He'd always felt overwhelmed by sheer otherness there as well. Simply being on the planet, in the city, on the streets where he'd spent his whole life, that didn't mean he could look into the face right next to his, so close he could practically taste the other's mingled exhalations of kimchi and friki'inuu, and see anything that resembled a mirror, anything that made him think he was looking at his own genetic code. That was a bad mental place to be in, especially for a cop wearing a big black gun inside his jacket. Even more so when you'd been working the Blade Runner unit, and you were supposed to blow away anything that didn't pass for human with you. That was the job. It had been his. It had been Dave Holden's and a bunch of other poor, crazed bastards, some of whom he'd worked with, some he'd steered a wide distance away from, catching that weird look in their eyes and the subliminal tick of a dynamite clock counting down. Some of the Blade Runners he'd known had wound up massaging the backs of their throats with their gun muzzles, and had gone under the ground in carefully sealed caskets. Others were still out there on the streets, chasing their own deaths, and the accusatory revelation that could only be glimpsed in the eyes of those you're about to kill or retire, to use that morally compromised departmental lingo. Riding in a worm-tread shuttle across another world's dead surface, Rick Deckard felt himself sweating, a crawl of self-generated excretions over his skin. An old, familiar claustrophobia tightened in his muscles, a shrinking from contact with the creatures around him, not to avoid their touch, but to keep them from being touched by him. Why should they suffer as he did? He opened his eyes and turned his head to look out the slit window behind him. A desultory wind moved red sand around like the floor sweepings of his heart. There were supposed to be other creatures out there, skinny wolf-like slinkers, all lank jaws and burning eyes. He'd thought he'd spotted one before, the barest glimpse of motion from the corner of his eye, when he'd been on his way out to the skiff rental yard. You didn't have to eat a gun to find release. You could simply wander out past the emigrant colony's limits, keep walking, and your splintered bones would be found, marrow sucked out like soft marzipan. To have spotted that wolfish spectre, seen it before its teeth closed on your throat, that was a bad sign. I've been here too long, thought Deckard. His neurosystem was starting to adapt, sensors working overtime, picking up the wavelengths of a world he hadn't been born on. That happened sometimes. Rumors and emigrant myths were rife. The whole process cannon firing ahead, not taking 2 or 3 generations to work itself out. At some unconscious cellular level, the poor bastard to whom it happens just gives up on being human, lets go, and becomes something else, like these things around me, Deckard glanced at the sullen, motionless forms lining the interior of the shuttle. One way or another, they'd already said their goodbyes to all the others they'd left behind. The shuttle ground on, nearing the emigrant colony's perimeter. A muted rustling moved through the seated figures, the mine workers rousing themselves from reptiloid, torpor. A muted rustling moved through the seated figures, the mine workers rousing themselves from reptiloid torpor. The tiny shifts of their bodies, raising of heads, glances out the narrow windows reminded Deckard of lizards on sun-baked rocks. The flick of yellow, slitted eyes toward an insect too far away to catch and eat. He supposed they probably were thinking about whatever meals were waiting for them. They had the lean, knife-ribbed look of people who went a long time between protein sources, in the dark shacks and nests of the colony's most silent quarter. Speculating about aliens with human faces and what their unknowable lives might be like had one advantage. It had derailed the even darker reverie into which Deckard had fallen, that pit lined with self-accusation he knew all too well. Now he could put on his own mask, the one that looked just like him but bore the name Niemand, and go home and see what Mrs. Niemand had waiting on the table for him. God only knows, thought Deckard glumly, as the shuttle slowed down to a crawl, the soft, labial flaps of the colony's ground transport airlocks folding over the windows. What Sarah would have gotten up to, decided upon in his absence. She was as far around the bend, he knew, as he himself was. The married state of the pseudonymous Niemands, the alias he shared along with equal measures of hate and guilt, was as mentally toxic as any sensory void to be found on Mars. No vacuum existed between himself and Sarah. The space between them was filled and overfilled with memory and the slow ebbing tide of the past that left things on a common shoreline. Old photos, sheet music on an untuned piano, names whispered in that sad moment between sleep and waking, empty bottles overturned by a fumbling hand. Everything that could be picked up, still tear-wet and studied as it turned to the same ashes in his and Sarah's mouths. No wonder she was as crazy as he was. How could she be anything else? Takes you back, doesn't it? The briefcase with Roy Batty's voice spoke up as Deckard totted it through the colony's body-dense main corridor. The hubbub of the black market stalls, customers and purveyors swirling around them. Feels like being back at home, doesn't it? Your real home, I mean. Deckard let his gaze, the hard, encompassing cop scan that had become ingrained in his optic nerves, pass over the crowd. He knew what the briefcase meant, what it had picked up on without even having eyes. The city vibration, the inaudible blood pressure hum beneath all the other shouting and murmuring voices, as he shouldered his way through, the briefcase dangling in one hand's tight grip, its corners catching like a barbed anchor against the press of others' thighs and hips. He saw the same faces he'd seen in his other life, the ones spent on Earth. Nothing had changed, at least in its essential sense. Identical eyes glittered too bright and hungry, whether they were naked or shielded behind dark lenses, or bombardier-style goggles, other eyes that he remembered as well, opiated or glazed over with any number of pharmaceutical combinations. The marketplace's recycled air smelled rancid, with the receptor-specific molecules exuded through the sweat upon shivering, pallid skin. And those whose eyes were still focused, but on some point far from here, a deific vision, they'd come to the shabbiest stall and overcoated, secret-pocketed vendors to find. Deckard remembered seeing those before as well. Just goes to show, he spoke aloud. Nobody in the crowd noticed a person talking to himself or having a conversation with the small luggage he carried. That LA's not a place, it's an idea. A bad idea. The crowd thinned out as Deckard got farther from the marketplace's center. He made better time, striding through the colony's residential quarters, his passage marked by the strips of loosened duct tape wavering overhead, stepping over the crawling forms of the stim-deprived terminal cases, their blank stares swiveling up in his direction. Deckard reached for the knob of his hovel's front door. The door was unlocked and slightly ajar. The slightest push of his hand set it drifting into the unlit interior. Old cop instincts held Deckard back, his gaze moving across the revealed angles of motionless space inside. "What's wrong?" The briefcase had sensed the hesitation. "Nothing." Deckard drew in a careful breath, as though he could roll on his tongue any stray captured atoms. Everything. Once he'd had devices to work for him, the full array of department-issued gadgetry, the trick units that came out of the LAPD's research labs, down in the deepest basements where the sunless geeks groomed their oscilloscope tans. The voice-controlled espers, the soft-breathing Void Kampf machines. Now he had to do it the old-fashioned way, firing up the subtle instincts that cops had depended on for centuries. Something crackled under the sole of Deckard's boot as he shifted his weight. Looking down, he spied the bright glitter of fractured electronics, splinters of metal, a wedge of an automatic clock face stared back at him, the little dots it had had for eyes blank and inactive. More bits and pieces of the alarm clock, he saw now, were scattered for several meters near the hovel's entrance. He reached down and picked up a broken corner of a miniaturized circuit board. Its edges crumbled as he rolled it between his thumbs and forefinger. He knew the green, gritted, fragmented side. He threw the green, gritted fragment aside, then pushed the door the rest of the way open. Deckard stepped inside the hovel, aware that it was empty of any other human form. He stood motionless in the center of the room, then slowly set the briefcase down beside himself. "How does that old song go? Something about another mule in your stall?" Batty's voice sounded smug. Whatever sensors had been built into the briefcase were still as sharp as Batty's had been, in either his human or replicant incarnation. "There were other men here, just a little while ago, as a matter of fact. You can tell that, can't you?" The silence of a thin smile could almost be heard. "And you know what else? I don't think they were here to check the meters." "Why don't you shut up?" said Deckard in disgust. "As if I care." The truth was that he did, though not for any reasons of jealousy. Whatever sexual or romantic claim he and Sarah Tyrell might have had on each other had long since evaporated in the fierce glare of what they knew about and had done to each other. Even the resemblance between Sarah and his long-dead Rachel, close enough to constrict his heart each time he looked upon the living face, wasn't enough to evoke any emotion besides hatred. She can do whatever she wants. We're not really Mr. and Mrs. Neiman, you know. Of course not. The briefcase's voice still contained its knowing smile. That would be too easy, being the same thing inside as you are on the outside. You haven't been that in a long time, Deckard. Tell me about it. He gazed around the empty space and toward the dark rectangle of the bedroom door. And of course, she can do whatever she wants, except walk out on you. Because she's not here, is she? He didn't answer, leaving behind the briefcase and Roy Batty's mocking, under-the-skin voice. Deckard strode into the bedroom, flipping on the switch beside the door. Low wattage light, yellow and flickering, seeped through the dusty web of tape and corner dangling patches on the ceiling. The air seeping through the leaks wasn't enough to draw out the smell of aging laundry and bottoming out mood swings. Mrs. Neiman isn't here, a different voice spoke behind him. She left. Deckard looked over his shoulder at the autonomic wall. Deckard looked over his shoulder at the autonomic wall calendar, the companion to the alarm clock missing from the bedside table. Where'd she go? The mountain-filled scene fluttered above the rows of numbers. She didn't, the calendar spoke aggrievedly, choose to inform me of her destination. Its voice darkened. She probably didn't even know. There'd been a time that he and Rachel had spent out in the wilds in a ramshackle cabin, surrounded by a dark cathedral of trees, north of the scene in the calendar photo. A too brief interval between their fleeing LA and his being forced to return. Nights colored silver by moonlight. Days blackened by the coffin that he'd sat beside, gazing at the sleeping face of the woman he loved. Sleeping and dying. The coffin, a transport module stolen from the Tyrell Corporation. The glass-lidded device in which replicants were shipped to the outer colonies before their 4-year lifespans could expire had been the means of stretching out their stolen hours together, of sipping half-life moments rather than watching all the time, all Rachel's life spill out upon the ground and seep away like rain. I thought I had it bad then. His grieving stationed by the slowly dying woman. The silent vigils between the dwindling minutes of her waking, looking at the picture on the calendar wall. Deckard knew he'd give the rest of his own life if he could, to be back in the midst of that dark forest, in the yellowed circle of a kerosene lantern, sitting beside the coffin and waiting forever, in the unending moment between one dream and the next. Mr. Neiman? The calendar's reedy voice tapped at the edge of his thoughts. He'd give anything, even the plans he'd made, the decisions and vows he'd sealed down into his heart about what he'd do with Sarah Tyrell, her fate and his. Even that. The calendar tried again, using his real name. Mr. Deckard? Hello? A slow nod, the drawing in of his breath as he refocused on the calendar and the flat, meaningless picture on its surface. All right, he said. So who was it she went with? I wouldn't know. She didn't tell me that either. The calendar had an innate dislike for details not being filled in. There were 2 of them, I could tell that much. They were talking in the other room, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I just have this little directional microphone built in, you know. Now, if I had the intercom option, if you'd paid to have that feature activated, then the advantages would be... Yeah, right. Deckard interrupted the sales pitch. A long-standing peeve of his was the way these low-rent domestic appliances were always whining for upgrades. How long ago did this happen? When did Sarah leave with these men? You should ask the clock. That's Morit's department. The clock's dead. Deckard didn't mind saying so. So you tell me, when did they leave? A fearful quaver sounded in the calendar's voice. The clock? She did that, didn't she? The calendar made an audible effort to pull itself together. I guess it was about maybe 6 hours ago that Mrs. Neiman, I mean Sarah, that she left with those 2 men. Gosh. Its voice faded, then picked up again. If it's any help, she left a note over there on the table. Deckard walked over and picked up the bullet that had also been left for him. He rolled it between his fingers, then weighed it in his palm. A wordless message, or one that didn't need words to get its meaning across. Sarah had probably bought it, and the necessary gun as well, down in the black market stalls, where just about anything could be acquired. Thus, she must have iced the nagging clock on her way out, Deckard figured, with whoever these 2 men had been. This one, he thought, looking down at the bright, tapered metal, was meant for me. The kind of homecoming surprise he'd been expecting for a while now. His caution at the hovel's front door had been mainly due to not wanting a hole the size of a baby's fist plowed through his forehead. He slipped the bullet into his jacket pocket and unfolded the scrap of paper that had been beneath it. Deckard. The scrawl was Sarah's handwriting, the big ego-driven letters she'd never lost. I'll see you later. The mute bullet had said as much, a warning, the cold kiss she'd greet him with the next time they met. He crumpled the paper into a wad in his fist, then tossed it into the rubble in the bedroom's corner. Off into the ozone, Batty's voice curled mockingly. The briefcase sat in the middle of the hovel's front room, where Deckard had left it. They like to do that. Take it from me. I know. They just leave. He stepped over the briefcase and closed the door. Not your problem, is it? He brushed away the dangling strips of peel tape. You should mind your own business. Ah, but you see, your problems are mine too. An invisible shrug. You and I, we just have so much in common, Deckard. I doubt it. He crossed to the hovel's tiny kitchenette. You're in a box, leaning over the sink, crowded with moldering dishes. Deckard rooted through the top cupboard. I've still got flesh to worry about. He found the square-sided bottle he wanted, pulled it out, and unscrewed the cap. So the answers to my problems are different. Like this one. That smells like scotch, or something close to it. He rinsed out a usable glass and poured a 2-finger shot into it. They make it here. He tossed back the first fiery swallow, gritting his teeth as it rolled acid down his throat. So it's not anything except grain alcohol and food coloring. Sounds grim. I'll pass, even if I could drink. Good call. Deckard emptied the glass, Feeling his gut contract with a hard liquid shock, he poured another and sat down at the kitchenette table with it, pushing aside more crusted dishes and fog-clouded glasses to make room for his elbows. He laid his head down on his forearms and closed his eyes. Exhaled liquor fumes cut the stale cloy of the hovel in his nostrils, an odor of sweat and pent-up anger that could never leak away through the poorly taped seams. He knew that he could fall asleep if he let himself. The fatigue would wash over him, an ocean with its leading edge tinged brown by the bottle's contents. He also knew that it would do no good, that it would last only a few minutes at best, the same as it had in the skiff's cramped egg coming back from the outer Hollywood station. A moment of darkness, then dreaming, then waking, with the border blurred between those two states. The way he used to raise his head and open his eyes, back in his apartment in Los Angeles, with an empty glass smelling of real scotch in one hand, the fingers of his other sunk into a silent chord on the piano's yellowed keys. Looking up at the faces in the old frayed edge, black and white photos that had drifted across the music rest like dead leaves, looking at them and, for a few seconds, wondering who they were, until he remembered again. "All right," Deckard took a deep breath, opened his eyes, and straightened up in the chair. With his forefinger, he pushed the glass and its murky contents away from himself. The room was small enough that he could twist around, reach back, and pick up the briefcase by its handle from where he had left it, sitting in the middle of the floor. He swung the briefcase up onto the table, laying it flat in the space he'd cleared. "Let's hear it. You got something to tell me about. Now's the time." She found out their names, or what passed for them. "I'm Wycliffe," the more talkative one said. He leaned his elbows back on the yacht's control panel. "He's Zwingli." "Right, I'm sure." Sarah Tyrell regarded the two men, her erstwhile kidnappers, or employees. The distinctions were getting a little confused. Maybe disciples, she thought. That fervent light still glowed way inside their eyes. If not her disciples, then Eldon Tyrell's. The two men had done what they could to mold themselves into copies of her late uncle, within the limits of the possible. They looked like children playing at a grim Halloween. "What were your real names?" Both men appeared puzzled for a moment, exchanging worried glances before turning to look at her again. "But those are our real names." "They'd have to be. The Tyrell Corporation gave them to us." That raised another consideration. Standing in the middle of the cockpit area, with stars and luminous emptiness shifting about on the view screens, Mars no longer even visible from here, Sarah wondered if she were the only human thing on board. "You two wouldn't be replicants, would you?" She studied them more closely. "I mean, it's all right if you are." Wycliffe shook his head. "No," voice flat and emphatic. "Replicants aren't given the kind of security clearances we have." "We're very high level," said Zwingli, "in the Shadow Corporation. You can trust us." Really, that amused her more than anything had in a long time. How charming to think that I'd even want to. She left them in their perplexity and walked back to the center of the yacht. They all just wanted to be loved, thought Sarah. It was as if the Tyrell Corporation had never ended, or had been recreated in miniature inside this little, hermetically sealed world, all familiar to her, from the time she had been notified of her inheritance to the moment when she had brought it down into ruins of fire and twisted metal. Her uncle had created an ass-kissing corporate culture, one where underlings like Wycliffe and Zwingli expected and even thrived on kicks to the teeth. I should be nicer to them. That would have really screwed with their heads. The furnishings of the yacht, an interplanetary model, small by the standards of the fleet that the Tyrell Corporation had kept, were familiar to her as well. Every inch of the executive quarters was slathered with the same degree of nouveau ostentation that Eldon Tyrell's private rooms and office suite had shown. Expensive enough to imitate taste, too expensive to achieve it. All the fakery that money could buy. Fakes of fakes in this case. Sarah recognized bits and pieces, imitations of the actual objects that had been consumed in the corporate inferno, right down to the Rococo pillars. Foreshortened and perspective cheating and thus crammed into the lounge's closer space. Window-sized view screen panels stretched to the ceiling. Layered pixels shifted slowly through a res-maxed view of an intricate herbscape. Elevated angle as though from the great arch windows of the office that had been her uncle's, then hers, then ashes. Los Angeles, all smoke and darkness, even beneath its hammering sun, rolling out to the panel's fall horizon. The yacht must have been set up for Eldon Tyrell's personal use. That would have been his preference, to travel between planets and yet seemingly not move at all. The view remaining as that seen from the center of his empire, or perhaps a sad notion. This was what the obsequious duo up in the cockpit had thought she would like. The past, or at least a piece of it, frozen and sliced like a laboratory specimen and put up here for the cold microscope of her eye to fasten upon. They don't know, people like them, minions and underlings. It wasn't their job to know, or even their nature. Sarah knew that she could tell them, let them in on the big secret, that she herself, the recipient of their servile adorations, had destroyed all they held most sacred, the Tyrell Corporation itself, and they wouldn't believe her. Or they would believe and not believe at the same time, mere contradiction being no impediment to true faith, especially for these believers, carrying on the great Tyrell cause, toiling in the shadows when the corporation had existed in the light. It had dealt in artificiality. Lies, really. Sarah had found it harder and harder to distinguish those from truth, from reality, whatever those might have been. More human than human, the Tyrell Corporation's advertising slogan. What the hell could that mean? Sarah shook her head as she lowered herself back into the padded embrace of a reproduction 18th century wing chair. The statement had always annoyed her. It was like saying, more real than real. The leather sank beneath her weight, the ship's simulated gravity gentle, unnoticeable as a kiss while sleeping. Was there a scale of realness, of humanness, upon which different things could be at different points? And did the points shift? A notion she found amusing. She rather liked the idea of becoming progressively less human. All the human parts of her nature had only caused her grief. Like falling in love. Sarah closed her eyes and thought of Deckard. That was a mistake, she mused grimly. That was what she got for even trying to be human. Better to have stayed at Tyrell, right to the ice-crystalled ventricles of her heart. A family tradition. A void conf machine slapped onto her uncle would have frozen up and died like a broken-winged bird in an arctic wind. So much for empathy as a way of determining who's human and who's not. A reproduction of the antique bureauplate from the Tyrell Corporation's demolished headquarters had been installed next to the wing chair. Sarah sat forward and pulled open the central door. The real bureauplate, now also reduced to ashes, driven into LA's concrete and rubble by the monsoon rains, had had several useful things in it. The repro desk had only the remote control for the opposite wall's view screen. That was enough. She leaned back and thumbed through the displayed menus until the phony cityscape had been replaced by a real-time view from the trailing opticals. Mars was already a red dot, everything on it even less from this distance, including that bastard Deckard. Her thumb rested on the remote's off button, poised for obliteration. She hesitated, one moment merging with the next, prolonging the sensation she felt. Not pleasure, she was beyond that, but a certain satisfaction, not with the present, but what was to come. I was a fool, Sarah spoke aloud, her words echoing against the hard metal bulkheads underneath the ersatz tapestries and wall hangings. Not necessarily for falling in love with him, for wanting the same thing that Rachel, the replicant with her face, could have so easily, but for thinking that she could get back at him. While stuck in a shabby little hovel in one of the Martian immigrant colonies. Money a weapon, revenge facilitated by all the power of the Tyrell Corporation. Even in this, its shadow form, the appearance at the hovel's doorstep of the die-hard true believers, Wycliffe and Zwingli had been the answer to the prayer she hadn't even spoken inside her own head yet. She had screwed people over both with and without money, the difference being that money and power made the screwing deeper and longer lasting, even terminal. Whatever works, she murmured. Her thumb pressed down and the image disappeared, replaced by blank wall. Sarah stood up from the wing chair and tossed the remote back into the bureauplate repro. An hour or so later, when she came back into the lounge area, the two men were waiting for her. They both looked fidgety and nervous, as though their impersonations of the late Eldon Tyrell were wearing through. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Sarah rubbed a thick white towel through her hair, then draped it along her neck. In the wing chair, she crossed her legs, letting the Tyrell logoed bathrobe part just enough to show the pale flesh above her knee. "Nothing too important, I hope. I'm still getting used to things again." While they organized their reply, she slit open the pack of illicit tobacco cigarettes she had found in the master's sleeping quarters. Golden Wood Dove, her favorite, from the farthest and least accessible of all the Capuchin warlord protectorates. Expensive, obtainable only through the UN's own diplomatic courier pouches. The Shadow Corporation's contacts must be well in order, along with their research. In the bedroom's closets, she had found a reasonable approximation of at least part of the wardrobe she had back in Los Angeles. sized down to reflect the weight she had lost on the emigrant colony's starvation diet. Miss Tyrell, as before, Wycliffe was the pair's spokesman. There's a lot we need to talk about. She tilted her head back and watched the ship's air circulation system draw away her exhaled blue smoke. You've already talked. She lowered her cool, level gaze to theirs. What more do you have to say? But you don't even know where we're going. Where we're taking you to, chimed in Zwingli. Does it matter? She gave an unconcerned shrug. Back to Earth, presumably. That seems to be the direction in which we're heading. She pulled the edge of the robe back over her knee. Los Angeles, perhaps? Is that where this little shadow corporation operates from? No, Wycliffe shook his head. A moment later, so did his partner. There's nothing there, at least as regards the Tyrell Corporation. His expression lapsed into mournfulness. It's all gone. The headquarters complex, the pyramid. Yes, I know, she sighed. I'm sure it was the sight of your happiest days. Get over it. Sarah flicked away the cigarette's ash. Zurich, then, or somewhere close by. I seem to recall that as being the branch office for most of our overseas operations. Wycliffe's eyes narrowed into slits. We don't talk about Zurich. Not inside the Shadow Corporation, that is. Those sons of bitches. Zwingli's face had hardened into an identical angry mask. Turncoats. Let's just say, Wycliffe's voice was as bitter as his expression, not all Tyrell Corporation employees had the same degree of loyalty. Some of the more remote branches of the company sold out to the UN security agencies, or they tried to. One corner of his mouth curled into an ugly smirk. They would have, if the Shadow Corporation hadn't gotten to them first. We took care of business, said Zwingli. Ours and theirs. I bet you did. If Sarah hadn't been convinced before that these two were left over from the old Tyrell Corporation, she was now. The culture inside the LA headquarters building had been nurtured by her uncle into a magnified form of his own personality. Inside that pyramid, the way to get ahead had been through murder, or at least a display of one's willingness along those lines, all in the service of the Tyrell Corporation as manifested by Eldon Tyrell. So Zurich's not on the grand tour anymore, I take it? Both men nodded their heads. She waited, but neither of them said anything more. They stood and gazed at her with an apparent lack of sexual appetite that she found offensive. Gentlemen, it's not that long a trip between Mars and Earth. Not aboard one of these yachts. Sarah took a long drag on the cigarette, taking it halfway down its length. She held out her hand to regard the glowing ember. And my patience is even shorter. She looked back at the men. So why don't you just tell me where we're going? They looked frightened, as though some moment they'd been dreading since birth had finally arrived. It's... Wycliffe's pale, large, knuckled hands tugged at each other. It's not that easy. Jesus Christ. It struck her once more that the pair's impersonations of the late Eldon Tyrell hadn't penetrated past the skin. Her uncle, at least, had had the courage of the self-absorbed. Show me, then. Wycliffe appeared relieved by the suggestion. He dug through the inside pocket of his coat and extracted a folding map, so old that the creases had turned to lines of soft white fur. He spread it out on the bureau plat, hands patting the paper smooth. You can't use the screen, she pointed to the far wall of the lounge, instead of that thing. This belonged to Dr. Tyrell. Wycliffe looked up from his insectoid crouch over the map. One hand hovered a quarter inch above its surface. His personal copy. What, he gave it to you? Wycliffe shook his head. No, he kept it here, with his other things. Fine, whatever. Sarah stubbed the cigarette out in the ashtray that Zwingli had scurried to fetch for her. Acquire your sacred relics however you want. She got up and stood beside Wycliffe, looking down at the map. Now, can you point? Can you do that much for me? He laid a fingertip on a spot in the upper left corner, a map of Western Europe. That much had been readily discernible, even through the rectangular grid of the fold marks and tears. This thing looks 1,000,000 years old, thought Sarah. Perhaps her uncle had it when he'd been a boy, when the world had been flat and the only things that looked human actually were. Sarah leaned closer over the bureau plat. The British Isles, but not England. Farther north than that. Her heart had paused between one beat and the next, a moment frozen between life and its continuance, when she discerned the exact place on the map. North of the Scottish mainland, far beyond Cape Wrath, beyond Thurso, at the very tip, into the North Sea, where the currents ran as cold as the pulse that now moved slowly through her veins. She knew where Wycliffe was pointing. She had always known, and why the two men had been reluctant to speak the words, the name. You see, Wycliffe spoke softly, his voice all kindness, sympathy. Right there. That's where we're going. She saw, she knew, a place she had never been to, but she knew what was there, waiting for her in that little spiral of islands, scraps of land, treeless and rock-laden, protecting another body of sea water from the greater, darker ocean surrounding it. A place that most people didn't even know existed, that they had forgotten, if they had ever known. Lucky them, thought Sarah. Memory was a disadvantage, a means of control. Her uncle had known that, had used it, the replicants he had created, the false memories he had implanted in their skulls. How much better it would have been for those poor bastards if they had been able to forget, if they had never known. How much better for me. Some of the memories in the dead Rachel's skull had been her own. Some of them were things that she would have rather forgotten. And the others, the bits and bleeding scraps that Eldon Tyrell hadn't seen fit to take and implant in her double's mind, that he wanted to keep a secret, big and dark, between himself and his niece. Those were even more worth forgetting. If they could have been. That's the trouble with the past, thought Sarah, closing her eyes for a moment. It was divided between the things you could never know and all the things you wished you could forget. Do we have to? She heard her own voice sounding like a child's, the one who had never died and never forgotten. She opened her eyes and looked at the man standing next to her. Go there, I mean. Why do we have to? We don't have a choice, said Wycliffe, a few feet away. Zwingli nodded in agreement. Neither do you. These things have to be done. But technically, I'm your boss, Sarah attempted a last-ditch argument. I'm in charge. I am the Tyrell Corporation. You said so yourself. Without me, there's nothing. Her voice rose in desperation. You're supposed to do what I say. I could tell you no. I'd forbid you to take me there. It doesn't work that way, Miss Tyrell. It can't. Why not? Still plaintive, still hoping, though she knew what the answer would be. We all have to subordinate our desires and our fears to the greater work. The true believer tone sounded in Wycliffe's voice again, low and fervent. For the sake of that which is larger than all of us, for the sake of the Tyrell Corporation, so that it can be once again as it was and as it always shall be. She supposed she could tell them the truth for all the good it would do. She could tell them that it had been her, the culmination of all her planning and scheming, her unsubordinated desires that had reduced the Tyrell Corporation to ashy ruins. They'd either believe her or they wouldn't, and it would make no difference. Everything would happen the way it had to, the way it had been laid out by a dead man. How did I think, she wondered, how did I ever think I could kill him, when Eldon Tyrell was still alive inside her head and in the path that never ended? And there, where they're taking me. Don't worry, came Wycliffe's voice. She couldn't see him, or the map, or the fall tapestries hung on the ship's bulkheads. Her eyes had filled with tears, a child's tears. One fell onto the paper ocean and seeped away, with any others that might have struck there long ago. Please don't worry, Miss Tyrell. He was trying to be soothing, to give some small comfort, all that was possible. We'll be there with you. You can count on us. Thanks. Sarah meant it, without guile or sarcasm. That means a lot to me. They left her, with the map still unfolded on the Reproduction Bureau plat. Wiping her eyes clear, Sarah stood for a while longer, looking at it and not seeing it. Then she went back to the wing chair and curled up in its protection, legs tucked beneath her. She laid her head against the upholstered angle beside her. At some point, while the yacht moved on toward its destination, to that place where the waters rolled over the deeply buried past, she slept and dreamed and remembered, which were exactly the same thing.